Hello and welcome to this on-demand event. This is the Bitesize series where this month we're talking about diversity and inclusion in assessment. So my name is Becky, I'm a chartered occupational psychologist and I've been working for the last 16 years in assessment and development. This is my colleague Jonathan Rook and he is the Managing Director of the Sova Middle East office. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk a bit about Sova. For those of you who have just joined for this episode, we're then going to be discussing how assessments can be used to create a diverse and inclusive workforce, followed then by questions and discussion. This month we're doing something a bit different. We're actually answering questions which have been sent in by clients beforehand. If you do have any other questions you want to ask throughout, please send them in the message box or let us know and we can turn on your video.
Yeah, just to, for those of you who've not joined us before, just to spend a couple of minutes talking about Sova, just in terms of who we are and what we do. We are an online assessment provider, and really our goal is to combine the best of science and technology in assessment. So from a science perspective, that's around ensuring that anything we are pushing out into the market is proven to predict performance. And by that, I mean on-job performance in terms of the role selection or development that we might be working on. So everything that we do has a solid scientific basis. We're headquartered in the UK, and most of our psychologists are chartered with the BPS. And really our aim is to provide accurate assessments. And we were actually the first people 5 years ago to put everything on mobile. And from there, we've developed further into the virtual environment. So from a technology perspective, we really focus on the candidate experience to ensure that everything's engaging and immersive. And part of this is around also enabling our assessments to be diverse and inclusive. And we're also working a little bit with AI technology and specifically machine learning. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that as we move through the content today. So as I mentioned, we're a global firm, so we're headquartered in the UK, founded back in 2015 by our CEO, Dr. Alan Bourne. We have offices now in Ireland, Australia, and obviously now in Dubai. We're into our third year here locally, and we've really seen a massive acceleration in terms of the amount of people on our platform. So we now have, looking at the platform this morning, we have 1,500 live projects across the globe. With 500,000 candidates on the system. And we've achieved that within 5 years. So we are very much a global organization, and we partner globally with different professional services firms and independent providers to work with us on assessments. But just a little bit about our platform, because this has evolved significantly even through last year and into the beginning of this year. But we basically have a unified assessment platform from which we can basically launch and run any type of assessment. So whilst we started with some of the psychometrics, and that will be familiar to most people from an assessment point of view, we've very much expanded that to include lots of other things. So our blended assessment methodology, and this is relevant for diversity and inclusion, is around combining assessment content. And by doing that, you can actually ensure that you minimize the adverse impact and you actually create a more diverse talent pool and eventually selection into different roles. All of this is underpinned by things like our immersive homepage, where we can put not just the psychometrics, but also assessment exercises onto those homepages. We can collect information from candidates about their CV and work history. We can launch questionnaires and videos, any type of multimedia content to improve that engagement from the candidates at the first point. We also have other technologies such as our video interview. We're doing some work with AI technology to enable us to analyze the text. We'll basically put video to text and then analyze that and provide scores in terms of what that might suggest about the candidate. Our digital assessment center, which is now fully virtual, enables us to run any type of exercise from our platform. And we also have things like 360-degree feedback, but all of this is captured in a central point for automated reporting. And also we can look at the analytics that sit within these assessments, not just in terms of the scoring algorithms, which are obviously important, but also thinking about whether our assessments are fair and they are indeed predicting something useful about the candidates or the participants that are taking them. And just to highlight and signpost a little bit about what we've been doing in diversity. So we've got numerous case studies that we've published relating to some of the clients we've worked with who have a specific focus on diversity. And as Becky mentioned earlier, this is obviously an important topic, and most of our clients are interested in this. And we tend to monitor diversity and check all of our assessments for adverse impact as a matter of course. But we do have those case studies available, which we can share, and we have some information in a white paper, which we can also share later on. But just to sort of think about some of the things that we're doing, there's lots that we can do from a methodology perspective. And as I mentioned, our blended assessment methodology is one way in which we can ensure that the data points people are using to make decisions are not just based on one single data point, which is where some of the issues around diversity can begin to creep in, and some of the biases in the process. From a content perspective, we tend to start from scratch, so with job analysis, and then putting together either new information, new item content, or mapping our existing content. But what this enables us to do is make sure that everything is contemporary and relevant to the population that we're assessing. Some of the other published tools on the market were developed back in the 20th century. The item sets are very much outdated. So actually what we have is a 21st century solution, which is really enabling us to create something which is very targeted and precise. From a monitoring perspective, we very much aim to review our adverse impact ratios and selection ratios on an ongoing basis, but you might also do that pre and post assessment. And then we can enhance that in terms of applying weightings or adjusting the algorithms that we have set in the system accordingly. And lastly, as I mentioned about the artificial intelligence, there's lots that we can do in terms of being able to adjust our assessments in real time. And we will talk a little bit more about this as we move through today.
So the importance of a diverse and inclusive workforce. So just before we get started on this, some definitions. So diversity, this really is about a representation of different people. So are there people from different groups? Is there diversity in individual differences and experiences? Inclusion, this is about including different people so that everybody has an equal opportunity. So what you might find is that some organisations are diverse but not inclusive, and vice versa. You might have an organisation which is very inclusive, there's lots of collaboration, but actually the opinions being given here aren't diverse, so it's not from a diverse set of people. Diversity inclusion trends. So some of the trends we're seeing here in this region are around building a diverse workforce which reflects society, and I think this is perhaps a global trend as well. The trend is also around ensuring assessment processes ensure fair decisions and effective hiring. What we really want to do is make sure that the right people are being recruited for jobs and they're not being discriminated against at any point in the assessment process. There's also changing demographics. So people are changing jobs or starting new jobs. You might have somebody who was about to retire, but they're staying in the workplace. So demographics are changing. They're not being as predictable as they once were. And then diversifying employee and employer relationships. So again, we've got people working in different ways. We've got some people running their own businesses, working with multiple employers. We've got other people in the company that they're employed by. So there's lots of different relationships, lots of different interaction, which needs diversity. And then tech acceleration. So the creation and implementation of new technology to drive businesses forward. So what we're finding is, obviously you need people who are creative or have different experiences to help develop the technology, and then people to help implement this as well. So bringing in diversity can help in this way. So just a few trends that we're seeing, which I think are also mirroring society and the rest of the world. And then more specifically, some regional trends here. So the UAE citizenship law amendments have come into effect. So these will reflect a focus on diversity and tolerance. So these decisions seek to attract the brightest minds, cultivate talent and small businesses. This was from the Gulf News in January. And then more recently, last week, we can see that the CBI called for FTSE 100 firms to have at least one racially and ethically diverse board member by the end of 2021. So this is a bold move, but a great move, and hopefully other organisations will follow too. This was also given further weight when a major investor, Legal and General, announced last week that it will actually vote against firms who do not appoint an ethnic minority director in the next 15 months. So these are just a couple of the different trends that we're seeing and information in the news. So why diversity in performance? What will diversity do? How will it help us perform better as a business and organisation? So study by McKinsey showed that diverse organisations are 36% more likely to have financial returns greater than their country's average. And also companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 25% more likely to have financial returns greater than their country's average. And not only this, but leading companies that perform at a higher level have leadership teams that are more diverse than those that have less diversity. So what we're really seeing here is diversity and inclusion can help build businesses, can help increase ROI and help increase performance. And perhaps two reasons for this are that actually if the leadership team is diverse, this will help lead the company in that way. And also diversity in teams means more shared, different values being shared, different opinions. So the impact of unfair decision making. So what happens if this doesn't happen? So if there is discrimination or unfair decision making, this can have psychological or physical effects on people. So we might see people having low self-esteem or feelings of isolation or physical symptoms such as stress. There's also the pay equality. So the age-old debate of the male-female gender pay gap. This can also make you feel not motivated or disengaged with an organisation. And then unemployment equality. So people might feel it's just simply unfair. So all of these together can lead to slower career progression and career injustice. So there's lots of reasons from the business side to have diversity and inclusion in organisations, and also from the individual side. And then just some challenges. So I'm sure you're all aware of these, but just a reminder, we can see the benefits, but actually what is preventing us from being diverse and inclusive? Well, this can come from unconscious biases, which we all have. So we can do things to help mitigate these, such as using objective assessments, keeping structured interviews, using ORSE models, and really just assessing people in a structured way to help reduce some biases. So biases are innate in us. It can be very hard to sort of change these, but we can do all we can to sort of mitigate them and to educate people into being objective. And then just to sum up, so diversity, inclusion and performance, so talent, so getting the right people in to lead and transform the organisation is key. If these people aren't there, then the organisation isn't going to change. And decision making. So the more diversity we have, the better the decision making, because more sharing of ideas, more evaluation, more risk analysis and greater impact. And then the journey to diverse and inclusive workforce starts with candidate attraction and recruitment. If we don't get the right candidates in, then we're not going to have a diverse workforce. And if we don't keep them engaged during the assessment processes, then we won't have them there either. So it really is key to recruit the people from a diverse pool and help keep them interested and engaged throughout the assessment processes. So just some process challenges then. So I'm sure we've all experienced different challenges at different times. So obviously there's the screening, the killer questions. It's about checking to see whether these are fair questions. Are you going to limit your candidate pool by asking some of these? So it's good to evaluate the CV screen. Are you looking for particular characteristics that perhaps you need to revise and look at something different? Are you are there biases towards us? Are you objectively screening candidates? Reliance on over reliance on academic achievements, is this being balanced by some skills or other information from the candidates? Then the interview, is this being conducted in a way which is objective and fair for all individuals? And the candidate journey, it's not just about the employer looking at the candidate to see if they're a right fit, but the candidate will also look and see if the organisation's right. So if the organisation doesn't come across as diverse and inclusive, then they may lose candidates on the way as well. And then how fair really are assessments? So we've mentioned a bit around the assessor biases that you might have and experience and the candidate experience, but what about the process design? So has the process been designed in mind to select and recruit diversity within the talent pool? And you can look at the data collection for this and look at collecting data along the way to try and gain diversity and to check where diversity isn't there. And then exercise scenarios, so it's the content not only face valid, does it feel right, but is it applicable for every person? Does every person understand it? Then how can we utilize technology to make things easier for individuals and level the playing field? But at the same time, we need to make sure technology doesn't discriminate. So for example, do candidates know how to record a one-way interview? Do they feel comfortable with this? So we can give practice questions, we can offer more support and assistance to help. And as I said, predictive validity is key. We want to make sure that assessments are being used to add value to a process and not just being used because they always have. Then just a couple of moments here for some points of reflection. So what we want you to do is just spend a couple of minutes reflecting. So thinking about, have you experienced or observed unfair decision-making in the workplace? And have you helped to change an assessment or HR process to ensure fair decision-making at work? So just have a couple of moments to think about this. As it's a useful exercise to think about how a candidate may feel, or to think about, how more diverse or inclusive could you be? Please feel free to send a message in the chat box or raise your hand and we can turn on your video if you want to share any points. And just while people are thinking, John, do you want to share any experiences you've had for either one or two?
Yes, I think on number one, on the unfair decision making, yes. I mean, I've seen sort of over reliance on a single score from an assessment. So maybe taking just one score on a cognitive test and then using that as a method for selecting out candidates. And the danger of that is that you might be missing out on candidates who have the psychological traits and the behavioral traits and the competency potential to perform in the role. Whereas if you just rely on a single source of data, and traditionally this has been cognitive tests, because that's one of the most predictive things in terms of job performance. But if you set cutoff scores too high, there's a real danger that you're missing out on people with significant potential from the talent pool. And I've certainly seen within financial services, several banks that I've worked with who are setting very high cut scores for cognitive numerical reasoning with a sort of, there's a genuine occupational requirement for them to say, for example, within a finance function to have high numerical reasoning, but you're not taking a rounded picture of the candidate. So that's one thing that I've seen related to one. And then obviously on two, I suppose that's the goal of what we're trying to do from a consultancy perspective, is very much to partner with our clients to help them to improve the assessment process and taking a step back from what they've done before, and then re-educating around blended assessment, whole person assessment, and taking the rounded view to try and improve the selection ratios of different diverse groups to minimize the adverse impact on certain groups, are very much to sort of look at the data and see what that's telling us.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I think we'll move on to the next slide, but if anyone has anything to share afterwards, please do get in touch. Okay, so designing a diverse and inclusive workforce. I'm going to hand over to John just to run through these slides here.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. So as I mentioned, there is a white paper that we have that we've just recently published actually on diversity and inclusion, which is bringing everything up to date from for 2021, and the context of last year and the pandemic and the ongoing challenges. So we have a white paper which we can share after the session today, and you can study that in more detail. But I'll summarize some of the themes that we've got in there. We can talk about these a bit further. So as I mentioned a little bit about at the beginning, in terms of our approach to addressing diversity, it's about using things like blended methodology. So that's not using a single assessment test, that's using multiple different methods to get to a decision about who to hire or in what ways to develop people. Content creation, the flexibility of our platform enables us to tailor the assessment content that we put into a blended assessment, and we can also write new content, for example, which is the case with things like SJTs or interview questions. We continually monitor and enhance, and that is the point around the sort of ongoing data analysis, and then wrapping that round with some end-to-end analytics and adjusting any scoring algorithms that we might have. So a couple of questions it's useful to kind of start with when you're thinking about creating a diverse and inclusive workforce. Consider what what good looks like in terms of your organization and the mix of talent and genders and ethnicities that is going to be beneficial to the workforce, because we know that having a one-size-fits-all is not necessarily the best approach. So a good place to start is thinking about what good looks like for your organization and the roles that you're looking at. And then secondly, to begin to explore ways to ensure that you have a fair and non-discriminatory process. And that's obviously, part of that is about looking at data, but it's also thinking about the type of content that you're asking people to complete. The ongoing evaluation of the data is obviously important. So you can continually run data extracts and have a look at what the data is doing across the different assessments, and then evaluate the process to understand whether there are any issues with the assessments that you have in place, and using the analytics to make informed decisions. And that's not relying on the analytics, because the analytics or the machine learning algorithm can suggest that certain things need adjusting, but ultimately it needs to be a human decision before you make any changes or make informed decisions. So some of the ways that we are addressing diversity with some of our clients, as I mentioned, we have a very flexible platform, so that enables us to do different things. But what we're really trying to do, it's things like gender diversity, ethnicity diversity, but there's also the point about cognitive diversity. So we know, for example, for high-performing teams, that cognitive diversity is important. And by that, we mean the difference of thinking styles and the different ways of working, which are important from a behavioral perspective. And ultimately, we know that that leads to higher performance, greater bottom line profits for organizations if we can have this cognitive diversity within an organization. I've talked a bit about the blended methodology. So what we're talking about here is not just psychometrics, it's assessment exercises as well, and being able to have this blended whole person view of candidates or participants. The content creation, again, I've talked about this a little bit, but we very much start with looking at the job, understanding what the requirements are, collecting data, talking to stakeholders, and then beginning to put in place something which is tailored for the organization, that we can ensure that there are no discriminatory test processes or items within that new content that we're creating. And very much now we're trying to make sure that candidates can understand the assessments. Some of the old assessments that you'll see on the market have slightly masked meanings in terms of some of the items. They're quite difficult to understand. The wording can be confusing. So we're trying to make this very clear, and we do that by using the technology to present things seamlessly and in a clear and fair way. And especially obviously when we're assessing people maybe with English as a second language in English, we have different languages available, but that can also be a consideration. So we need to make sure that everything is calibrated at the right level. And as I mentioned, the monitoring is important. So the ongoing analysis of the selection ratios and the group differences and using statistics to understand what those look like. So this is just a couple of highlights from the white paper. As I mentioned, we can share this later on. It's freely available to download via our website as well. The competency modeling, so typically when we go to clients, we will take their framework and we will develop an assessment that measures their framework and nothing else. So that very much enables us to create something which is targeted for the organization. And we know, therefore, it will be more predictive and precise rather than taking something off the shelf and then trying to understand what that might mean for the clients. And the job analysis as well is important, and understanding the diverse populations that might be applying for roles. Secondly, the second stage is around creating a prototype. So thinking about the type of language and the context of the questions, how we're presenting those, whether we present it on a home screen or a traditional assessment interface, and making sure there's no bias or language which might confuse people or introduce bias into the process. We also, when we're mapping onto client competencies, we have a statistical modeling software, so we can check whether some of the items are going to have adverse impacts based on the model. So that's based on data we already have. But then after a period of time, we can then calibrate that further with the client's assessment data. We usually pilot our tests, specifically if we're creating something from scratch. We typically would pilot that to check again about the adverse impacts and the any potential disadvantages for different groups. And then we'll monitor that on an ongoing basis. And as I mentioned, with the analytics and machine learning, we can effectively train the algorithms to highlight where there might be issues with certain assessment items, or to look at how we can adjust the scoring mechanism that we put into the system. In terms of welcome and job preview at stage 4, again, we very much tailor our assessments to be inclusive for the population that we're looking at. So this could be things like language, visuals, or different scenarios that we might be using. Again, this is one of the benefits of not going from an off-the-shelf perspective. Developing something bespoke enables us to develop scenarios which are directly relevant for a given organization, rather than relying on something which was developed several years ago. And our multi-method assessment, again, as I've mentioned, this is about having a single coherent assessment containing all the combination of different things. So it's not just the psychometrics. It could be things like critical experience questionnaires, business simulations, but all of which are relevant to the role that we're assessing or developing for. At stage 5, there's other things that you can introduce. We're doing a lot of work with clients who are using our virtual video interviews. And one of the things we are developing at the moment is, as I mentioned, the video to text analysis, which can then create a score based on that. But we're not looking at using things like facial expressions to derive scores. We're very much trying to keep it scientific from the perspective of analyzing those text transcripts and then allowing the machine learning algorithm to derive a score from that, which can then be adjusted by an assessor accordingly. There's other things we can do with the Digital Assessment Centre as well, which is now fully virtual. So we can also, we can analyse, for example, the bias that might be inherent in some of the assessor scores. So one of the benefits of having that on the unified platform is that we can take extracts of how assessors are making scores and then just analyse that to ensure that there's no issues in terms of the scoring, but also having a look wider at the candidates and the biodata that we capture at that point as well. So just on the machine learning, because this is obviously a large area, and it's really a subset of artificial intelligence. So the machine learning is around training the parameters that sit within the algorithm so that it can make adjustments based on what we tell it as humans. And what that actually enables us to do from an adverse impact perspective is to make adjustments whilst the assessment is live. So we can, if there's an issue that has been thrown up through the data, we can then make adjustments in the system. The system will highlight it, and then we can make a decision in terms of a trained psychologist or assessment specialist to think about whether this is something we want to do. But basically it allows us to continually diagnose, optimize, and refresh our assessments for fairness. And just to sort of give you a sort of visual depiction of what that might look like, obviously we designed the process up front to be optimized for diversity and inclusion, but obviously we don't really know until we've captured some data. So when the assessment is live, obviously we'll have the assessment data in the system, but we also do things like we capture the hiring manager feedback as new hires are starting. It might be performance data as well. And then we will take continuous feedback loops. These could be 3, 6, 12, 18-month feedback loops, and we'll continue to review that in the system. And so that's the point of where we can then begin to make changes to the assessment content, changes to the items, changes to cut scores, or the actual scoring algorithm that we're using to define an overall score. Okay, and I think I'll hand back to Becky at this point to talk about some of the practical steps.
Okay, so just some practical steps now to make assessments more inclusive. So we've talked a lot about diversity, but how can we make them inclusive? So I think the job analysis is really key here. If we understand the role requirements and understand what competencies we need and what we're looking for, then we can make it inclusive for people. Multi-method assessments, as we've mentioned, so not just having the CV screen, but having an interview as well, combining these with psychometric assessments. It just means we get more chances to see the individual and it's more objective. Accessibility of languages and accessible assessments. So can candidates access the assessments and also the languages applicable as well? Norm groups, are we comparing individuals to the right people? Are we going to discriminate or not put people through because they've got a certain score? And who are we comparing these people to? Reasonable adjustments, are these being made if candidates need them? Are candidates being asked if they have any reasonable adjustments to be made? Trained assessors, so it's useful to think about what training assessors have gone through and what refresher training they need. Sometimes we find the more experienced the assessor is, then actually that can lead to biases as well. Then the 4/5 rule, so we want to make sure that no one group of people is more than 80% in the population to make sure that we have diversity. We want to obviously look at cut-off scores as well. So we're going to come on later in the slides to talk about this, but we can use artificial intelligence, machine learning to review these numbers and to go back and for the system to amend assessments as we go to help this. Then candidate feedback, are candidates being offered feedback? Is it fair, the feedback? Are the assessments validated? And then, as I said, it's about reviewing the whole process and thinking about, how can we remove human error and how can we use AI to help with this? But at the same time, we need to ensure that the information we're giving the AI is the most appropriate information and that no biases have been put into that. So we all know the story of Amazon, I think male input into the assessment process, and actually the assessments were found to be biased towards females. So it's worth just thinking about what we're pushing in, what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, and then evaluating it using the data. And then I think this is just covering what we've already said, you know, assessments are made for the mobile now, they're personalised, immersive. So we want to put the candidate in real life experiences, the flexible, candidate-led, data-driven and unified candidate journey. And then assessment technology, I think we've covered these. So we have lots of technology that we can incorporate to help sort of reduce adverse impact. And then if you move to the next slide, John. So what we have, just to show you here, so on our homepage, so imagine a candidate's logged in and they've got some different tasks to complete on our portal. So they've got some information about the company, they've got situational judgment tests to take, some assessments, but they've also got diversity monitoring. So here, what we're seeing is a big trend in organisations now having a section around diversity, having information about it, about how the company themselves are diverse. And then you can ask some questions. So if you go to the next slide, so we have now some questions you can ask. I suppose it's like a mini diversity survey. You can change questions, you can use our standard ones, but this is just to really capture some key diversity information which we can use as part of the data analysis to validate the assessment processes. Okay, so that's real whistle-stop tour of what we're doing in the D&I space. As you can see, there's lots to it, because you know, diversity isn't just about ensuring you have diversity in terms of ethnicity or gender. It is about individual differences. It's about cognitive differences. It's about ensuring different people have different places to work. You know, it's diversity in all different areas. So just some questions that we've been asked. So I said at the beginning, people have sent in some questions and we've just themed them, sort of put them together into different sections. So I think we've covered most of these, but just to sense check. So John, first question then. So what opportunities are there for leveraging a diverse, inclusive workforce? Yeah, how great is the opportunity, do you think, now?
I think, yeah, I mean, just conscious of time, but very quickly on point one, we're in a situation now, unfortunately, because of some of the job losses, that we effectively have a more diverse talent pool. So actually, that creates an opportunity for organizations to go a bit wider than they normally would in terms of finding the right talent for roles, but also to develop their internal talent further as well. So I would say, you know, there is an opportunity. Obviously, there are lots of the downsides of the pandemic, but I think what we're seeing from a talent management perspective is a wider talent pool, and that's an opportunity.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've answered question 2 about the technology, but do come back to us if you want more information on the specific technology. But 3, I think this is an interesting question. You know, AI, there is a debate, you know, is it fair, you know, if we allow a robot or a machine to decide and make decisions about people? So what we say is it's always about the input. You know, it's fair if you're programming the computer to make the right decisions. And of course, we all know about Amazon. I think it was the sort of male input programming, and actually then there was biases towards women in the selection process. So we really need to think about what we're putting in, who's designing selection processes, who's giving the machine the information. And again, this comes back to the variation in the job analysis, the competency selection, talking to lots of different people, getting input and monitoring and evaluating and using the machine learning to help update processes and change things where needed. And then I'll just touch on point 4. So this is all around, you know, we've talked a lot about recruitment, but actually this is just as important in development. Ultimately, you want to recruit people who stay in the organization. So they need developing, and you also want to help develop them to make them strong leaders or strong managers for the future in your company. So all of this applies as well in a development context. You know, we want diversity again for the different teams. We want to bring in different opinions and encourage great debate. Okay, and does anyone else have any other questions at this point? I think we're just sort of run 5 minutes over, but are there any questions anyone wants to ask? I mean, please do write in the chat or email us afterwards, and we're more than happy to answer. Okay, I think we'll just go to the next slide. Yeah, so if anyone's thinking of any questions to ask, just some next steps. So if anyone wants more information, let us know. Our next event is on June the 28th, and we will send you some information about that shortly. And yeah, we have a Sova community. So I think I mentioned this last time, but if anyone would like to join, it's a great community of, I suppose, professionals all around the world, not just here in the Middle East. There's lots of information, articles, training courses, and just really a chance to connect like you would on LinkedIn, but in a secure and closed environment. So yeah, please do let us know if you want some information about that.
I think we had just a quick question that came through from the chat, just asking about whether candidates that have been through Sova assessments perform better in their jobs than non-Sova assessment hires. The short answer would be yes, because we know that the blended methodology is robust, and we're continually collecting data to link assessment scores back to job performance. In terms of the direct comparison to other tools in the market, that type of research is ongoing, but I would say very much we know that the evidence we have at the moment is very much suggesting that. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, any other questions? Okay. Well, as we said, yeah, please do write in or ask us any other questions. And yeah, thank you for listening. We have gone over, so thank you for staying on. It's great again to see so many familiar faces logging in. I think it's really sort of creating momentum, these groups, in this session monthly. So we really enjoy doing it. Please let us know if there is anything in particular you want us to talk about or cover or discuss. And yeah, I think next month we have a guest coming on, so we will release details shortly and you can send in questions for our guest. But yeah, thank you very much. Anything final to add, John?
No, thank you for listening. Normally we have guest speakers, like you said, and normally they're a little bit more interactive, these sessions, but I think this is a good sort of entree into the topic, and yeah, look forward to discussing further.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.